here. All right, here we are for another episode of Coffee with the Founder. I got my cup here.
There we go.
Flash, 100-yard dash from one of our favorite family movies, Zootopia.
That's a great mug.
And speaking of favorites, one of my favorite friends and colleagues is joining us here, Jesse Heffernan. Jesse, we're doing these coffees with the founder just to introduce people from the WPC family, my network, to our followers, our participants, the folks who are in our circle of love, so to speak, just to let them know the wonderful folks who are not only doing stuff when they're at the conference, but the stuff that they do once they leave the conference, the work they do in their communities, so on and so forth. So we're glad you're here today to talk about your work, but let's just start with an introduction. If I meet you at the subway stop or bus stop in the airport and I say, hey, I'm Eddie, give you a little list of things I do, how would you introduce yourself? Who is this guy we have here with us today?
Yeah. Well, first, if you met me at the subway or the airport, I'd probably be wearing a mask and gloves, and we'd kind of like not shake hands, because that's the thing. So I would introduce myself. I'd say, my name's Jesse Heffernan. I'm a recovery coach, a professional recovery coach, a consultant, and a trainer with a small business called Helios Recovery Services. And what I work on is helping create and develop anywhere from grassroots kind of consultation and technical assistance to advising to some legislative efforts. And then also a big piece of it is training recovery coaches and building that whole field and that kind of platform for folks to start developing themselves as paraprofessionals in the recovery field.
Yeah. Now, when you say recovery coach, what does that mean? Because I think sponsor, I think when I was in recovery or am in recovery and going through that process, I had a sponsor. I don't know. What's the difference? What's a recovery coach versus sponsor? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So when we think about the lanes that a majority of the people are familiar with, we've been indoctrinated with a lot of idea of like what AA is and what 12-step is, right? And the people that are helping people in those areas are primarily sponsors. And so someone with a certain amount of recovery time, kind of like mentoring and guiding someone through that particular kind of fellowship. And then we also have like your traditional like substance abuse and substance use counselors and therapists and folks like more in the clinical field. And what's interesting is that the recovery coach in what we call the peer services world is like the lane down the middle, right? And so someone like myself is a person with lived experience, meaning that like, I'm in both substance use and mental health recovery. I can use my experience, and with some training, I can help guide people into their pathway of recovery. And so I'm not fellowship specific, as you would say. Like, I believe in multiple pathways. I believe in abstinence-based, moderation-based, medication-based recovery, harm reduction, that there's more than just the 12 steps out there. And so I'm not about getting someone connected to a particular fellowship. It's helping them look at the whole picture of their lives and say, well, here's a fellowship that might work for you. But we also focus on a lot more of the quality of life, right? So we're looking at finances, we're looking at physical health, emotional health, spiritual health, all those components. So a coach can really help navigate and guide with a person to find those areas of life that they might be struggling and get connected with the resources in the community, which also includes me getting them connected with fellowships and sponsors and with the medical and those kind of treatment services that they need. So it's building a whole kind of thing for people. And the last part of it too is really just about like the community advocacy. So, I can have my own personal program of recovery, but I can come out and say like, I'm Jesse, I'm a person in long-term recovery. And that's important to be able to talk about those things this day and age.
Now, can anybody be a coach? I mean, are there any requirements, any kind of expectations? I mean, what does it take to be a recovery coach? Because it seems like in the traditional recovery model, to be a sponsor, you needed a certain amount of kind of sobriety time.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk about that a little bit? I don't know if even qualifications is the word, but there seems to be, as we talk about recovery coach for sponsors, some different levels of at least expectations to hold those
Yeah.
standards.
Totally. And I think that this is a relatively new field as well. I mean, this isn't even like a 20-year-old field, really, when we talk about recovery coach services and peer services. So the expectations really vary widely from if you're going to go through different organizations, and also like there's a lot of states that have what are called peer specialist certifications or certified peer specialists. So their requirements might be different. Like in the state of Wisconsin here, if you're going to become a what they're calling like a dual diagnosis or a certified peer specialist, you have to have lived experience with mental health or substance use. If you want to be a family peer specialist, you have to be a family member that's been impacted. And then certain organizations, and there's an interview process where you may have to have a certain amount of recovery or clean time under your belt in order to go through those trainings. The training that I do, the CCAR training, which stands for Connecticut Community for Addiction Recovery, it's pretty wide open. So anyone who's interested in working in the recovery field, which I think is really important when we talk about like, one, I don't have to self-diagnose or put out there that, you know, I have this diagnosis, if you will, as a person with like substance use or mental health. So I'm not using my pathology as a means of being able to get in and get a job. Um, I don't have to disclose that information. And two, it really broadens because there's so many gaps right now. When we talk about nationally, you know, 23 to 25 million Americans needing recovery support services of some kind, and only 11% of them giving it. I think we could a bigger open field would be best to be able to help navigate services and be able to get connected with those things. And so if anyone's ever interested in it, I'd say definitely look at, you know, there's some national curriculums like CCAR, but also look and see if your state has a peer specialist certification itself.
But just so I'm clear, Jesse, when you say peer specialist, is that synonymous with recovery coach?
In some states, yes. In
Okay.
some places, it's not. So
Okay.
some people will go through the 30-hour recovery coach academy to put that towards their hours to become a state certified peer specialist if they go that state route. You could take the 30-hour training and then do 30 more hours and get recognized by that organization with a professional designation and be what I am, like a recovery coach professional. So I did like 60 hours. I went through an interview process. So there's a lot of different, like there are pathways of recovery from
Yeah.
substance use and mental health. There's pathways of this field as well.
Well, I want to pick up with that then, pathways to recovery, because I'm an old school Bill W. Alcoholic Anonymous guy, right?
Yeah.
It's just the
Yeah.
only thing I knew. It's the
Yeah.
only thing I came through. And can you talk a little bit about how the pathways to recovery has expanded from what some of us who got into recovery, 20 years ago may have gone through simply Alcoholic Anonymous?
Yeah. And I think it's important from like a historical context, even realizing that Dr. Bob and Bill W., they endorsed and promoted the idea that there's more than just the 12 steps. And in fact, a lot of folks back then, so it was you do these 12 steps and you get therapy and you do this and you do this. So they promoted the holistic version of it. And so we kind of refer to that as like the first generation of recovery. And then slowly what happened was you got kind of like this dogmatic evangelizing side of recovery that came out, you know, and it was, well, you do the 12 steps and that's it. Like, oh, you're feeling depressed? Well, work your steps harder. Well, you're doing this, well, work. It became more, you know, aggressive in that sense. And I think that's where like a lot of that punitive shame-based recovery came from, you know, like I need a sponsor that's going to, you know, kick my ass and do all this stuff. And now, like, we're slowly starting to open back up to that kind of first generation mentality where it's like, okay, you can do 12 steps and you can do this and you can do that. You can be a part of refuge recovery, which is a Buddhist-based meditation practice. For recovery folks, there's secular, there's life ring, there's all types of kind of pathways happening right now. And I think that's what's important. As effective as 12-step is, and there was a recent study that came out from the Recovery Research Institute that folks that go to it do see some pretty good rates of like long-term recovery. However, there hasn't been enough time to really look at the entire field of what the other kind of pathways are doing themselves. But one thing that they did note was that of the odd million Americans, that are in recovery, only 46% of them are in recovery due to traditional group support services and treatment. So that means the other almost majority of folks have just found, like, just got over it. They found their way into recovery, and for them that could just be family or church or running or yoga, and they stopped using. So I think we're really expanding our worldview as to what it means for people to have their own program.
Yeah, yeah. So there's so much there. I mean, I think again, as not only kind of a old school kind of narrow framework in which I got introduced. I mean, um, I'm still kind of pushing myself to just open up about what some other types of recovery paths are, the pathways are. But what about the different addictions? I mean, when you look at something like alcohol or opioids or crack, and you also mentioned mental health, has there been any work and research showing that one of those are better for the other? Because sometimes I feel like crack cocaine is a different drug than marijuana. So therefore,
Right.
I need the
Yeah.
coach that's gonna kick my butt. What's your sense of kind of those different drugs, those different path, or
Yeah.
different ways in which people get addicted? Does the or could the pathway assigned make a difference? Or
Right. Yeah. So, and to be clear, like, I'm not a treatment specialist or a doctor, and I don't, I mean, what limited research I've done on, like, neuroplasticity and what different substances do to the brain, like, my scope in that world is not as large as what it is in the recovery pathways world. But what I've seen and found is that, like, so one, a lot of folks who are opioid dependent that may go on medications for that, a lot of times they've experienced, like, ostracization from traditional 12 steps because they're not quote unquote clean, right? And so
mm,
we've seen a massive influx of what they're calling heroin anonymous meetings, right? So those groups are getting bigger, and then you see medicated assisted recovery support groups starting to get bigger. One of the things I did learn is that, depending upon the substance, like, the modality of treatment doesn't necessarily have a one size fits all. Like, how you would treat a chemically dependent alcoholic may not be the same for someone who's dependent on meth or crack or heroin. But yet, that's traditionally how we've seen this system work out, right?
mm,
It's like, if you think of any other disease, if I'm coming in and, I've got cancer in my thyroid, and the doctor's like, I just do liver, like, there might be some, like, basic things that go over it, but there's going to be some adjustments. And so what the treatment community, I think, in large part has failed to do is to adjust their sales correctly to the independent needs of folks that are coming through their places. Whereas the recovery coaching in the peer world, it's all about shifting ourselves to where that person is at, right? And saying, like, when I meet with someone, I'm going to lay out all the options on the table. And if that person needs detox, well, there's not a lot of detox beds here. So what is your home regimen going to look like? And it's going to suck, and it's going to be horrible for 5 to 10 days, right? Um, how can we meet that person where they are, and provide all these different things? And I wouldn't say there's one recovery pathway that works for a substance better than the other. It's more about that social connectedness, finding people that they can relate to. And sometimes it's just about, like, um, just being heard and supported for the very first time. So coaches and peers, like, another word I like for it is like a compassionate witness, right? Like, I'm just holding space with that person. And I'm not saying, like, in order to get through my program, you got to jump through all these hoops and do X, Y, and Z. I'm saying, no, like, let's look at this, and I'll meet you where you're at. If you're not meeting your goals and your objectives and your potential, we'll adjust. We'll make it different. There's not a reason for you to get, kicked out per se, if you go back to and you have a reoccurrence of symptoms.
yeah, yeah. I want to ask you, like, if you were talking with a parent, um, what would you say? Okay, just say hello to Mr. Jesse as we do our
Hey,
interview.
it's good to see
And
you.
I'll get your dress fixed here, and we can get rolling. So here's Mom. She'll fix your dress. Thank you, Nye. Thanks. Say bye, Mr. Jesse. All right. So our first, that's how it rolls there. Thank you, Nye, for
Yes.
stopping by. I was going to ask you about um, the population of folks in recovery. I mean, you mentioned 20 plus million. What I was wondering is, what does that look like? Because it feels like, and I want to ask you more about some of the differences between the nation's response, it feels like, to crack, which was primarily folks of color, Black folks, and now let's just look at even opioids and a big majority of white folks. So I'm really trying to keep those two questions separate: what it looks
Yeah,
like
yeah,
in the recovery industry, but also the response in our nation around those two just examples.
yeah.
And then what do you see going forward?
Yeah. So again, like it's a rough estimate that there's about like 25 million Americans in recovery, right? And that can mean a lot of different things for a lot of people. And again, those are based off like smaller sampling sizes, and then they kind of like correlate that to the rest of the country, kind of a thing. It's really hard to get an exact grasp because not everybody wants to self-identify as a person in recovery. Some persons might just like, have episodes where they have, um, become chemically dependent in extreme use. And there's again like gradation and variance in what that looks like, and then stop. And so are they a person in recovery? Did they just stop? Like, what does that look like? So the numbers, fluctuate as far as what that is. Um, but I'd say like 6 to 7% of the population you could probably estimate. And when you look at the number of folks that identify as using, I mean, the great state of Wisconsin, right? Like typically Wisconsin has 10 out of the 20 drunkest cities in America year after year, right? And that says a lot when you've got that many bars, more than grocery stores, more than churches. So a large population probably is dependent on alcohol, and then figure out from there. When it comes to our country's reaction to and how they've handled recovery supports, if it's not the most like systematically riddled version of what it looks like to have disparities based on race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, like I don't know what is. I mean, like, just look at all of our support services, but you look at recovery and treatment in general. And yeah, I mean, like, even before the crack epidemic of the 90s, I mean, you go back to the war on drugs was started because the FBI wanted to single out, you know, Black people and people that were smoking pot, and so they're like, how do we make these two the enemies of the state, right? And how do we take prohibition laws and put that all on the Black community, and how do we continue to systematically oppress these folks? And then when you know different folks from the southern Pacific Islands and Chinese and Laos workers were coming over, like, how do we pen opium on them and keep them in a spot, right? And so, like, I mean, this is hundreds of years, like, kind of like in the making, I would say. I mean, most recently the drug war is one kind of variation of that, but we continue to see these systematic exploits of how we're going to disenfranchise people. And so, like, yeah, I mean, we did very little to nothing with the crack epidemic, right? But when it became the coke epidemic, and it was about like rich movie stars who were skiing, um, lo and behold, like, there were commercials, and Hazelden was like, we can help you, kind of a thing. And it took that turn. um, I think with the opioid epidemic too, right? Like, if we would have addressed the opioid epidemic at the level we're doing it now 10 years ago, when it was hitting primarily like urban and inner city communities and lower socioeconomic communities, we wouldn't be at this point. If we would have had, you know, the governor's task forces and the president task forces and all these folks, like, impacted, as it were. It started somewhere, and we didn't want to address it because it wasn't, quote unquote, our problem. And I had family members, and I saw, back in 2009 and 2008, how this was slowly starting to creep in, especially with pharmaceuticals. Um, you could watch from Chicago, Milwaukee, all the way up the eastern part of the state, and 41, as heroin started moving up, and you'd start seeing overdoses, and you'd start seeing dealing and all this stuff. So, I mean, I think we've failed in a large part, and having watched what's happened the last couple of years, I think that the recovery community has become the loudest voice and the greatest advocates for it, and having had to push legislators and politicians and leaders in communities to address these issues and to change them. And what's different now, I think, is that we're able to have to bring the conversations about, these systematic atrocities at the same time. So we have more folks are stepping in and saying, like, this impacted, Black communities, communities of color, socioeconomic. It's impacting the LGBTQ community greater, right? And now we're bringing that to the table because we don't want this to happen again.
Yeah. So what are you saying to parents? I mean, if you got a parent
Yeah.
listening today, right now, either with some concerns or trying to be preventative with the young people in their lives, and it could be even a family member or a friend
Yeah.
of the family, even.
Yeah.
What's your advice to them if trying to really get ahead or out ahead of
Yeah.
some kind of addiction, working with or dealing with a young person in the house or in the family?
Yeah. And there's some great work done by a Columbia PhD, Dr. Carl Hart. He also does a lot of addressing of, like, the different disparities and everything. But when I saw him speak a few years ago over in Minnesota, the biggest thing I got from him is he's like, honesty and transparency go so far. Like, I'm going to be honest with my kids. I'm going to tell them what I see, what I'm experiencing, how I feel about it, that there's repercussions and consequences with these things. Like, I think it's really about just like deep, powerful conversations, crucial conversations with our youth, and realizing that they don't need to be handled with kid gloves. I remember when I was like, 14, 15, 16, and the conversations that adults and parents chose not to have with me rang almost louder than the ones that they did, right? I remember the things that weren't spoken. So who's left to fill in the gaps? I am, and the people I choose to put around me, right? Like, drugs aren't gateway drugs. Other people are gateways to harder drugs, right? And so the more that I needed to fill in all this information, the more I found it from the people who are willing to give it to me. So as parents, I think the other thing is that I've had some friends that have lost kids, and unfortunately, like, that's the conversation we have to have with parents today. You need to be thinking about what happens if your child or loved one passes away, right? And there was this one parent in particular who said, you know what, like, all the books out there and all the meetings and all this stuff that was telling me I was enabling my kid or telling me I had to do tough love, she's like, I just followed my heart, right? Every single day I followed my heart with my kid, and I listened to things, but I did the best I could to be there for them. And when she passed away, she said, I didn't have the same regret I saw other parents have, right? She knew how to have boundaries. She knew how to be there for her kid, and she just followed her heart in the whole thing. And I think that's the biggest thing, is like, find people that support you where you're at inside of here, and read the books and read all the different stuff, but really kind of follow your heart in all of this.
Now, whether it's one day of lived experience or 30 years plus,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm assuming quarantine, let me rephrase that. I know quarantine takes its toll.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, we were talking before we got on, there are just so many other ways I could balance and distract myself from some of
Yeah.
the callings of addiction. Whether
Yeah.
it's watching a game or going to the gym, none of that is here. What's your word of advice? What are you saying? How are you assisting people who are really in the position of quarantine, but
Yeah.
still dealing with, trying to stay sober?
Yeah, I mean, I want to acknowledge, like, I feel blessed to have the amount of, like, privilege I have to be in a home where it's safe, where I can talk about this stuff. And I know that there's individuals that are in situations that are, like, extremely toxic or volatile, or maybe they don't have running water, or maybe they don't even have bed to sleep in. So that's the first thing, is like, I've got some basic need stuff, right? And that's a result of a lot of different things. Um, so it's really hard to say, like, here's a blanket statement, of these things. Um, it's been difficult. Normally I'm good with operating at like a level 3 to 5 anxiety, but it's been like a 7, and I'm like, oh man, I gotta work from this place. And so what I've loved seeing is that the recovery community has pivoted really quickly to providing meetings in this kind of a source, right? To be able to do this kind of stuff. The recovery community organizations that I see across the country who are creating meals and having like social distance contact with folks to still meet their needs and talk to them, just to unpack some of the pressure that's being created as a result of all of this. I think some of those things, like, this is breeding a lot of innovation and creativity as to how the recovery community is going to adapt to these situations right now.
Yeah. What about the diversity in recovery? It feels like to me, especially in my earliest days, that it was a pretty white function, a pretty white organization, pretty white mechanisms and processes that, can turn a person away, quite frankly. So what's your sense of the diversity amongst the recovery community, and primarily those in charge of those running the
Mm,
structures and the
yeah.
institution, as we look at this increasingly diverse world that we're living in, and possibly, more and more people of color wanting and needing some assistance in this area?
Yeah, I think, again, we go back historically and we look at the roots of like 12 step and being kind of pulled from like Judeo-Christian roots, right? And kind of privileged roots in a lot of sense. And that was like the framework for it, and understanding, like, prior to that, there's a great book by William White called Slaying the Dragon, and he accounts, recovery support circles going back to First Nations folks and like having talking circles and being able to just find the therapeutic value of people talking to each other. And so, um, we as white colonizers did the best to co-opt as much of that as possible and coin it as our own, and have done wonders with it. But I think that, the idea of recovery fellowships have, because they also have that connection to spirituality and religion, have taken off in different communities. um, as far as like the anonymous side goes, right, as far as like the meetings go and stuff like that. And so you'll see meetings in Milwaukee and Chicago and communities starting to build there. But when you step outside that anonymous function, and like you said, you start talking about the leadership, where are, leaders of color, where are women, where is the LGBTQ community? We're just starting to see that. We're just starting to, I think that power shift of, the folks with privilege are starting to see, like, oh, we need to move out of the way. And some of them are being more than just invited out of the way, they're being called out of the way, being like, I had this guy, Devin Reeves. He challenged me. He said, if you're going to go speak on a panel and you ask, are there any women on the panel? Are there any people of color on the panel? And if there's not, turn it down,
Mm.
right? Turn it down, even if it's paid. And that's tough, right? Being in a spot of like having a small contracting and consulting business, and like most of my work gets recognized from those kind of things, but it's what I've had to do. I've had to be like, you either change this, or you're just throwing wrenches down a hallway of an echo chamber of things people have already heard all this time. And so that'd be my invitation for anybody in this spot, is like, if that's not represented, you know um, how do I get out of the way and allow for that to be able to happen? And I think the Mobilize conference was a good kind of thing for last year too, like inviting you to speak, on the drug war and have we gotten anywhere, and really just lay it out for people that may not want to listen or have been listening, that we need to really change the structure of what this looks like and the leadership in this structure.
Now, do you think COVID-19, quarantine, time of quarantine, is going to have any kind of impact in reference to how people will be different once we leave this time? Meaning that, it felt like to me the recovery community is one of hugs and handshakes and, connection.
Yeah.
And now it's being forced to deliver a kind of need virtual to some extent, but at least in social distance.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, I think in education, people are saying, well, maybe this is a new way that we'll have to be
Hmm.
as we look forward educationally. What's your sense of this possible quarantine impact on the recovery community?
I think there's a few layers to that. Yes, one, we're going to continue to have a significant amount of virtual space, and so the thing that the virtual space has always tried to get to is like where are folks in communities that aren't reached or that don't have transportation, but it was never a priority, right? Um, Now all of a sudden they're like kind of like getting the benefits of this, and so we have far more people being reached in areas that we didn't prior to. So that's great. That's a great outcome to all of this. We've seen the loosening of restrictions when it comes to telehealth medicine, right? And the billable services for those things. And so they've made significant changes that are going through the end of the year so that people can start getting online services like this to address their substance use and mental health needs. So that's another great thing. And my hope is that we can continue to perpetuate that after December as well, that we see the benefit of all of it. But when it comes to like that physical connection piece that you're talking about, I say that we're like in a time of physical distance but social connection, right? Because we've maybe even stepped it up a little bit more with what we're doing this way. But the hesitation, and I think of like the long term impact this is going to have on people not shaking hands after a meeting, not hugging folks. Is there going to be a way that we slowly kind of reacclimate back into that? And I hope so, because I think as social creatures, we need that physical connection. We need to be held. We need to be touched. We need to be in presence of others. Um, I hope that this doesn't further isolate us or create fear or panic of touching people in the future. I hope that we can heal from all of this and get back to that spot.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's just one of those questions that it's going to be hard to answer until we see the evidence. But
Right, right.
then, yeah, having that thought, I was wondering about recovery homes,
Hmm.
recovery houses.
Yeah.
What's your sense of the presence of those, the effectiveness of those? And if I'm looking at one of those for a family member or a kid of mine, what are some pieces of advice you would give folks making that decision?
Yeah, so there's a host of what we would call like sober living or recovery living houses, transitional living. Um, there's an organization called NAR, the National Association of Recovery Residences, who have developed kind of a four-tier system of different types of recovery houses. In some states, Wisconsin included, has like an independent board that actually goes out and looks at the houses, right? So you'll like right now in Wisconsin, I could go out in front and just put a sign in my front yard and be like sober living, $500 a month. And there we have it. I am now providing sober living. Um, with very little regulatory process around that, right? So we're trying to play catch up, whereas some states like Arizona had an influx of recovery housing, right? There was people shipping people there all the time. Anyone could open up sober living, and so they've had to create more regulatory processes. And so for anybody across the country, I'd say first look and check and see if you've got a NAR board or association of some kind, the National Association of Recovery Residences. Two, when you're looking at these things, call ahead of time, or visit ahead of time if you need to, right? Ask for a tour of the place. Make sure that everything's up to code. I mean, some of these places got folks sleeping on the floor and detoxing. We had some houses in Madison that were fronts for drug dealing. I mean, of course, there's like kind of these stories about what could go wrong, but I'd say there's more often than not places that are doing it well and doing it right, and but with all these different areas, like call ahead of time, check it out, talk to other folks in the recovery community, and of course if you have like a recovery organization or coach, you can talk to them about it as well.
So, Jesse, tell us, what are you going to be when you grow up? The next 10 years of your life, give us a sense of
What
what's
am
on
I
the
gonna
horizon. What are you
grow up?
excited about? What's to come for you as you look at let's say the next 10 years of your life?
Yeah.
What are you excited about? What's cooking?
What's cooking? So one, and I got to say, like, I was really excited to attend WPC this year before it was canceled. It would have been my first year. I was so looking forward to being a part of that. Um, from behind the scenes and attending workshops and seeing all this stuff and the work we've been doing. So I know that that's definitely part of addressing this stuff because, the recovery community, like this is only going to work when we are able to better create equity across services and across the board and stuff like that, right? Because yeah, sure, it was opioids and then it's meth and then what's next? And clearly we haven't learned that we need to identify these things when they hit communities first. And so how are we going to build that up? So I think looking at more of those kind of systematic approaches to these things and inviting more leadership to the table is definitely one approach. Um, I'm looking forward to doing more just kind of coaching training and getting that network developed. I'm really excited about that. I'm really excited about just kind of watching where this field goes. And hopefully being able to have a small part in making sure that there's fidelity and this space for coaches and peers to be not just the gophers or the entry level folks, but to really get treated that their lived experience is valuable. So those are some of the things. And then also seeing you know what I can do to fit in more so with like what my kids are seeing and how they're addressing things too, right? Because I mean, they're already in this grade school era where these issues are coming up and talking to them about it. So I'm also hoping to start connecting even more so with them as my oldest starts to go into junior high next year. So that'll be fun.
Yeah, yeah. Well, um, I know an area that we share some affiliation is superheroes or comic books or uh,
Oh, thought you,
Marvel and some of those areas. And before I ask you about some of your top
oh boy.
suggestions for folks, what I wanted to ask about is often I see in the movies, maybe not so much in those kind of movies, but movies in general, smoking, drug use, partying, so on and so forth. And um, I think I wonder if what kind of attention should I be paying to that as a father of a 9-year-old boy?
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, you know, um, do you see that the uh, um, the middle school age Marvel is that a safer space in reference to um, kind of the influence around drug and alcohol use? I mean, what's your sense
Hmm.
of movies, particularly those kinds of the Marvel movies and their influence on young people, but specifically as it relates to issues that they'll be grappling with?
Yeah. Yeah. And so gratefully, like at least a lot of like the Disney versions of stuff, at least the stuff that's not on Netflix, doesn't go like I'm not going to show my 9-year-old Jessica Jones, that's for sure.
Right,
Um,
right.
but as far as like the general overall movie sense, like I haven't seen or had too much personal problem with like their portrayal. I mean, other than like, Thor, with Doctor Strange and his thing of mead filling up over and over again, right? Like, I mean, there's some reference in those and it goes with the whole Norse mythology piece. But I think, again, like going back to that question earlier, like the bigger thing is, with our 11-year-old and 9-year-old, is that we've been just very transparent about the conversations. We had a few years ago, our daughter came home and been like, all my friends, their kids' like their parents are drinking and they have alcohol. Why don't we? Right? Great. Let's talk about that age appropriate conversation and really talk about why that stuff's not in the house. And I think that, that's the kind of like maturity we want them to have about this, right? Like not everyone who uses a substance is automatically addicted. This isn't like a doom or gloom thing. But by the way, there's genetic factors and environmental factors that might put you at higher risk than maybe some of your friends, right? So we need to really be careful and transparent and talk about these things as we move forward. Um, I was looking at, there was like an old comic I picked up the other day, and it was how comics used to address drug issues and stuff like that. Like there was Green Arrow, Green Lantern, when Speedy, of all names, like this big picture of him, and he's like, there's a thing of heroin out, and like Green Arrow walks in, he's like, my ward is a junkie, what do I do? And but that was like back in like the late 80s, you know, and just for a comic book company to take it on at that level, I think that's what creates a lot of conversation, you know. And different companies, they've taken on different public service kind of pieces as how they're going to address drug and alcohol issues. Tony Stark, of course, is an alcoholic. In the comics, he's a recovering alcoholic, right? um, so there's kind of different components of it. And again, overall, I've been pretty okay with how they've shown that stuff in the movies. The TV shows, not so much. It seems to be a little bit more glorified and easy to put out there, just because it's I guess, more of a select mature audience. Um, but overall, it's been good in the movies.
Yeah, that's a good point because I was thinking about Jessica Jones,
Mm-hmm.
but more specifically Luke Cage. You know, like I never really had a black superhero, you know, on
Mm-hmm.
TV I could watch, or Black Lightning even,
Dude,
right?
Black
So,
Knight, Black Lightning's really good. I'm so
right,
glad
like
there's a
you
new
gotta let
season
my
on.
9-year-old get exposed to that just because I know how important it is to see himself, and also we can share that moment. But there are some issues and some scenarios that maybe I'd like his innocence to remain in place, so to speak. So I
Right.
didn't know, as you mentioned Jessica Jones, I think about Harlan Quinn being the father of a daughter, right? Do we want, I want
Yeah.
her to have that empowered woman kind of experience? And at what age do I do that? And what's healthy, so on and so forth. So how do you
Yeah.
grapple with that, you know, as a father of daughters as well, and wanting them to have that empowered opportunity?
Mhm.
And sometimes I think when it says comics or DC or Disney, it seems to be more appropriate, right?
You would think. But there's some DC shows that, like, we won't, like, I've got 5-year-old twins, twin girls. There's this DC show where it's just like, it's just showing like these younger women versions of a lot, like Wonder Woman and all these like Batgirl and all them, but very like come and save me princessy and very catty and very like, I'm like, no, you're not, I'm not gonna show you this. Like, this is not how these characters are portrayed, at least in a lot of sense of modern day comics. I mean, we've evolved quite a bit from all those things. And so we've really taught, especially our oldest daughter, like, it started with, again, the conversations, the empowerment, the getting the girls empowerment books and finding the appropriate characters and teaching her about these things. And also saying, like, a majority, 85-90% are written by men, right? So this cannot be just her only purview of how women are portrayed, and TV shows and movies too, right? Um, so we can be like, well, here's the book, but know that might be written not from the appropriate context. And I was looking through some comics the other day because I went to our storage and I pulled out like 3 boxes of all these comics while we're on quarantine, right? And I'm like, oh, this should be fine, like this 80s Flash comic book, you know? And it had some really heavy adult content in it still. And so I think as a parent, I have to look through all of them. I have to make sure that they're appropriate. And if there's going to be questions that come up, I got to be ready to have those conversations about stuff, to be able to navigate those things. And even Harley Quinn and her evolution, right? And her latest movie is the emancipation from the Joker. Um, I know a lot of people that, like, you know, really romanticize the Joker Harley Quinn relationship, and it was volatile and toxic and abusive. And I'm like, stop it. You know, like, it looks great, it's portrayed great, but no, that's not healthy. That's not, like, I don't want that on my cake for anything, you know? Um, so again, like, I love the robust conversation that comes out of it, and they can be a great teaching tool for our young people right now.
Well, let's close out then with some suggestions from you, because we like to close out on a lighter note, asking
Yeah.
people, is there anything you've watched that you've learned something from that you would suggest, or that you just enjoy or have enjoyed that allows you to disconnect? Because we're building a little list of suggestions for folks.
Yeah.
What are some of your favorites recently that you would suggest for folks that either you've learned from or you just like because it takes you away, or a combination of those things?
Yeah, so I've been like, the two on the queue right now is, one is Community. So I mean, we ran through The Office a million times, but Community is just more of like this somewhat self-aware comedy that takes place, in a community college and stuff like that. And they've hit on some issues, but it's also got a lot of geek references, which I really like, right? But I've also been watching Man in the High Castle, which, if you're not familiar with that show, it's based off a book in which the people are living in a reality where Nazi Germany won. And they learn that there's alternate realities where that didn't happen, but just the implications that it brings up and the conversations, and it really is challenging on a lot of different nuanced levels as to what could have happened and why these other realities are the way they are. And it's also very scary to see how they portray those things in that world and the parallels in our current society of
Mm.
what's going on. So it's really caused for my wife and I to have a lot of conversation about these things and look at this stuff. So those two have been really good. And then, of course, I've been watching the new season of Black Lightning. And I think that that show, similar to the Black Panther movie, they do really good. And Black Lightning has always had like that social justice kind of like undertone to it, addressing these kind of things back from when it was started in the 70s. And I think they've done a really good job of keeping that relevant to the TV show as well. And granted, it's the CW, so it's got like some CW corniness to it, but with the good comes the bad. So
Well, listen, Jesse, I appreciate you, man, giving us some knowledge around a variety of things.
hey,
And
my pleasure.
this has been really helpful for me and for our listening audience. And we'll look forward to posting it. And thank you for your time, and keep on doing the work. And although you weren't able to make WPC this year, you are always invited. And we're
Oh,
looking forward to being in collaboration with you.
for
Take
sure.
care. Be safe.
You do the same. Thank you so much, Eddie.
All right. Peace.
Bye bye.